E dano la spattane corde, la citta stanado, la pioggia la copparanotto, e la... Oh, sorry. I momentarily slipped into an Italian daydream. Why, you say? Because I am in a wonderful Italian mood. Today we finished the turning of Mr. Majestic here. You want to join me? Stick around. Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Phil. Welcome to my shop. This is part 2 of a 3-part series on how I make Mr. Majestic, my Tuscany-inspired vase. The links to the other 2 videos are listed in the show notes below. In this video, I'm going to show you how I turned it on the lathe and constructed my Mosaic inlay. We've got a lot to cover. So without further ado, let's get going. Alright, this is where we left off in the last video. As you can see here, I'm just rounding over and finishing the bottom part of the vessel. The tool that I'm using here is a simple flat round carbide cutter that's been freshly sharpened on my diamond hone. The great advantage of turning segmented pieces is that all your cuts are side grain. These carbide cutters cut through them like butter and leave a really nice smooth finish. As I'm building out this vase, it's a good idea to get in there and do some sanding before it gets too narrow and I can't reach it. I'm power sanding here with an extension. Works really good. Okay, skipping ahead a little bit, I'm now at the point where I'm reaching the flute of the column. Here I'm switching over to my traditional roughing gouge. Once I get this all flat, then I'll switch back over to my carbide cutter. And the reason I don't use the carbide cutter at this point is because there's a lot of glue squeezed out between those joints, as you can see there. And that glue is very hard. Being that the carbide is not truly a cutter but more of a scraper, it tends to grab onto that glue and it can actually pull out chunks of wood, which you don't want. Whereas the gouge will simply slice through the glue without a problem. I'm getting ready here to carve out the pocket for my mosaic work. However, I don't want to make it too wide. I want to keep the diameter within the circled ring that I'll be using as a dam to hold in my resin. I made the ring from cutting off the top of a plastic bucket. And now I just draw a reference line to indicate the bottom of the pocket and another parallel line to indicate the top. This top line will limit the height of the resin pour. Any higher than that line, the resin will spill over the walls of the dam. So this area here is where I'll carve out the pocket. I'm just using a 1/8 parting tool for this. Being that my mosaic pieces are about 1/8 of an inch thick, my goal here is to get a depth at about 3/16. That should give me plenty of room. The consistency of the depth of this cut is very important to be uniform from the top of the line all the way down to the base. This depth gauge helps to achieve that goal. So now I just keep making these 1/16 inch depth cuts across the channel at about every 1/4 of an inch. And then I go back and connect the cuts. And now I switch over to my square carbide cutter and I level out the whole channel. And now I've taken the piece off the lathe and I mounted it on my bench, getting ready to now construct my mosaic. But first I need to mill up some lumber so I can cut my mosaic pieces. The mosaic pieces are going to be 1/8 of an inch thick, and I'll cut those out here in the bandsaw. These strips are going to be a 1/2 inch wide, so once setting a 1/2 inch, I continue cutting the rest of the strips. This is my homemade mosaic cutting jig. I've done a lot of flatwork mosaic pieces in the past. I prefer to work with several different triangular pieces. This jig allows me to make repetitive cuts, and as you can see, I've got several angled fences for different triangular patterns that I like. It takes hundreds of these little pieces to make a mosaic, and this jig definitely makes the job go much quicker. I keep my pieces separated by size and by wood species. And every time I go through the trouble of setting up this jig to make pieces, I like to make a lot of extra ones as well, so I have more for future projects. Okay, so now it's time to cut out my copper strips for the mosaic pieces. And this is pure copper. Because the copper is so soft, it turns very easily with traditional woodworking tools, including the carbide tools. My strips all need to be 3.5 inches long and 3/16 of an inch wide. This will give me just enough to wrap around each individual piece with a little left over to trim off. This is a homemade double scribe tool that I made for just this purpose. I made it from 2 CNC carbide bits, and I have them spaced out exactly 3/16 of an inch. I love working with this copper. It cuts very easy with traditional scissors. Now this is how that double scribe works. One side is as sharp as a razor, and the other side I dulled purposely with a file. And all I do is press the dull side up against the edge of the copper and then make my scribe. By doing this, all my reference lines will be exactly 3/16 of an inch wide. Now here I'm straightening all my strips. The tool I'm using to do this is just a pair of nylon pliers. This is the same tool that jewelers use to straighten out wire.
Pardon me. Have you seen the like and subscribe button lately? I think they're down here someplace. Would you mind clicking them for me? The like and subscribe. And the bell, too, to remind you of future videos. I certainly would appreciate it. Sure, I'll wait. Come on! Click them!
Okay, so now I'm about to wrap each piece with the copper. I start off with the copper being at one edge, then I press really hard around the whole piece. And when I get to the other end, I bend the piece over, and then I give it a nice squeeze with the nylon wrench. Being that the copper is so soft, it holds its shape pretty well. And then I trim off any excess. Now it's time to glue the pieces on. And I'm just using regular Titebond glue for this. Just a little dab to tack them in place. I just press them down for about 30 seconds, and then I'll go on to another one. And here I am about 4 hours later. And you might have noticed that I threw in some Purple Heart for some visual interest, about every couple inches or so. All the spaces are finally filled in. Now I go back and I look for wide gaps. I like to take advantage of those places. I fill them in with little squiggly pieces of copper. These little details just make the piece a little more interesting. Okay, now I'm taking my ring here and I'm going to attach it to the piece. And as I said before, this is just acting as a dam to hold in my resin. And if my calculations were correct, I should be able to pour this all the way up to the line without it going over the dam. In my last project that I used this ring, I attached it to my piece with hot glue. This time I thought I'd try something a little bit different and use duct tape. And even though this duct tape did work okay, it was a bit more messy at the end. I'll probably go back to the hot glue in the future. The resin that I use is Alumilite Clear. It's the slow version. And this stuff is real easy to measure out. It's simply a 1:1 measuring ratio. I'm using Alumilite black dye to tint the resin. Once the dyes thoroughly mix, I add in some black mica powder. This powder just adds a little more depth into the color. This resin only has a 12-minute open work time, so I gotta work a little bit quickly. It took a total of 3 cups to fill this up. Before I add the other 2 cups, I take an acid brush and work the resin really good into all the cracks. As soon as I pour the resin, I immediately put it in my pressure pot. This is a 10-gallon pressure pot with a diameter of only 15 inches. Now when I designed the vase, I purposely picked the 14-inch diameter, knowing that this would give me a ½ inch of wiggle room on both sides. Trying to twist these giant wing nuts is pretty hard on my fingers, so I grabbed a chunk of oak in my scrap bin, turned it on the lathe, made a handle, and I put a slit in the other end. Problem solved. I then set the pressure at 60 psi. The pressure doesn't actually eliminate the bubbles, but it does squeeze them to a very small microscopic view. You cannot see them in the final pour. Okay, here we are back to the lathe. Notice that I'm using a heavy-duty leather glove on my left hand. Resin can be very brittle, so you have to be really careful. A few months ago I had a piece explode on me, and unfortunately I was not wearing the glove. The plexiglass shards really ripped my hand up pretty bad. And as a matter of fact, as you can see here, I switched over to my negative rake scraper. That small round carbide tool I was using a moment ago was resulting in too many chips. Negative rake scrapers are much more forgiving. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to remove that ring from the piece. I'm removing the resin that leaked underneath the tape. And I'm making very small, light cuts, just slowly working my way to the piece. As I said before, this resin can be fairly unpredictable. I don't want any surprises. Once I got fairly close to the surface, I switched over to my diamond-shaped carbide. This allows me to slice right underneath that bottom portion of the ring, allowing me to break it loose. Once I've removed that excessive resin on the sides, I can now take my dead blow hammer and knock the ring loose. And now it's time to get messy. I suppose I could take my bowl gouge out and probably get rid of this stuff a lot quicker. But again, I don't want to take a chance with blowing out another piece like I did the last time. And there's no big rush. This negative rake scraper is cutting just fine. Now that I'm getting pretty close to the surface, I can go back to my small round cutter and just take nice light cuts. Now that I've finally reached the surface, I'm going to switch back to my negative rake scraper. The Mosaic has hundreds of little small delicate pieces, so I need to be super extra cautious at this point. I'm making very light cuts, and I continuously sharpen my scraper at the diamond wheel about every 5 minutes. And all that copper is really starting to shine now. And here I make my final passes with a smaller scraper. Okay, we're going to fast forward a little bit, a few rings more, and I'm going to smooth out the inside of this column before it's too tall and I can't reach it. My square carbide cutter works perfect for this. And as I work my way up the neck, I continue to move my steady rest as well. It not only cuts down on the vibration, but it also relieves stress that's put on that glue block. And the last thing I want is for this vase to crack loose from that glue block and go flying across the shop. And I know what you're all thinking. And the answer's yes. It happened to me once before. Now that I've roughed out that flute with the carbide, I just go in there with my Sorby scraper and smooth it nice. And after a little bit of sanding, I continue to glue up the last couple of pieces. And finally, the last two pieces are glued on. So here you might notice that I'm turning in reverse. Now I know some people may say, well, you should never turn in reverse. Reverse should only be used when you're sanding your project. However, I would agree with that philosophy if I didn't have any Allen keys to lock that chuck really tight to the lathe. I've been turning in reverse for years. I've never had any problems. After turning the mouth of this vase with my small carbide cutter, I switch back over to my negative rake scraper and finish the cuts. Now that the inside is done, I can bring up my tailpiece and secure the piece with my cone. I can now also take away my steady rest at this point. Incidentally, these flat carbide scraping tools that I've been using are all homemade. And I buy all my cutters from the good old captain himself, Captain Eddie Castellan. And if any of you folks are new at turning, check out Eddie Castellan on YouTube. He's got a lot of great videos. Although carbide cutters are technically a scraper, if you keep them razor sharp and if you turn at a fast speed, you'll get some beautifully smooth cuts. And a lot of turners don't realize that you can actually resharpen carbide cutters. All you need is a diamond credit card and some lapping fluid. So here it is, all done. All the surfaces were all hit several times with a double rake scraper, and it's already very smooth to the touch. All that's left now is the sanding and the finishing.
Where did the time slip away? Okay, we'll call it a day at this point. We'll pick back up at the next one. I really hope you found some value in this video. If you learned something today, please give me a like and subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to ring that bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. In the next one, we'll go over the sanding process and I'll show you how I apply my lacquer finish. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Phil DeCarlo. Until the next one, cheers.